So, how has the year started for you and Jethro Tull?
Well, the year has been a mixture, a lot of promo because of a new album coming out. And we were a week before last, we were in Italy doing some concerts. My promo activities continue really through March into when we travel to Finland on the 1st of April for a bunch of shows.
Yeah.
But yeah, everything is good. It was when we played in Italy last week. It was the first time we'd done a show for 6 weeks. Yeah, and so it felt like 6 years because time just rushes past. But it was it was remarkably familiar getting back on stage. It was the same set list as last year, whereas in Finland we start off with a new set list for the rest of 2025, which is a lot of different songs, some of which we haven't played in many years. So a lot of changes that require a couple of days rehearsal coming up in 2 weeks' time.
So it seems that you are quite busy.
Well, I think it's good to keep busy, especially at my age. It's keeping busy is not just physically but mentally good for body and soul. I'm naturally an industrious person, so I do try and create a little bit of free time for myself to be a tourist because I don't have very much time when I'm traveling ever to visit cities and places of interest, places of cultural interest, museums, galleries, churches, cathedrals. So I do try, every couple of weeks, I try and have a little trip to do something, very often to places I've visited many times in the past, but not as a tourist. So it's good to get a chance to walk around and see places.
But you don't want to do it like while you are on tour, that you would have like a less hectic touring schedule and then you would have time to do that, or you prefer going there as a tourist and sort of have the time on your own to go there?
Well, if you think that one through as an implication, if you take time on tour, a less hectic schedule, that implies days off, which means paying everybody for days when we have no income. So,
Yeah.
of course not. The answer is no. Once you're on tour, you tend to work. I mean, sometimes you have to take a day off for travel because of distances and practicalities. In fact, we have a day off, I think, not a day off, a travel day in our Finland tour. It's something we have to do, but it's a day of expense and no income. And that is not something I particularly want to have to do. I tend to go away really just to play one or two shows at a time and come home because I've spent so much of my life traveling,
Yep.
being away from home, that I do try by and large to sleep in my own bed for 3 nights in a week.
So the reason we are talking is because Curious Ruminant will be out on March 7th, and it's actually your album number 24. So how does it sound for you?
How does it sound? Well,
Yeah,
goodness me.
like album number 24.
Oh, I see. Well, I
It's
don't.
quite an
I'm
achievement.
not counting. I know my age. I know when Jethro Tull began, but I'm not someone who keeps statistics to do with. And anyway, it's very arguable when you talk about albums. Do you mean new releases, or does that include compilation albums? Does it include third-party albums? Does it include solo albums? It's a very arguable term. So,
Yeah, I think you would go around like, I don't know how many albums, but a little more if you count those in as well.
yeah, well, sure. It just so happens I've been in the last 4 years, there have been albums, three new Jethro Tull albums released. But in the case of the first of those, it actually began back in 2017 and didn't get finished in 2018 because of the pressure of touring. And then COVID came along, and that meant I didn't get to finish it and release it until 2022. But I moved on straight away to record another album released in 2023. In the summer of last year, I started work on Curious Ruminant, and the earliest release date possible was March of this year. And so here we are with another Jethro Tull album, which seems to, in people's minds, follow on closely from the last two. That is somewhat reminiscent of back in the 1970s when we had a new album out every year. But then it was just touring and recording. There were no days off. I mean, I didn't have a holiday for a whole decade. The other guys had time off here and there, but for me, writing, recording, rehearsing, touring, I mean, I worked every day for 10 years.
That's something that musicians don't do anymore.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't live in the music business world, so I have no idea what they do. I have no idea. I know a few musicians, but not something particularly we talk about. And they're people I probably hear from once or twice a year. So I don't have a circle of friends in the music business. In fact, I don't have a circle of friends. I'm not a gregarious person. I don't have buddies. You know, I have a family. I wouldn't describe myself as being a social animal. I don't have either the need or the wish to be in groups of people doing whatever people do together, whether it's eating or drinking or going on vacation or playing sports or hanging out at the gym or whatever people do. I don't do any of that stuff. So I'm a bit of a loner. And it's the way I was as a child growing up, because I had two older brothers who had already left home. So as a child, it was like being an only child. In my childhood years and as a teenager, I was, I was on my own. And I liked that. I grew to like the opportunities that come without social obligations. So I could spend my time reading and learning and drawing and painting and then learning to play music. I rather liked that solitude, and I enjoy that today.
So like you said, like 3 albums in 4 years. So I guess you still get like very excited about like creating something new and releasing new music, even though you've been doing it for a couple of decades so already.
At the point of having an idea for a song or an album, whatever it might be, then within a few days, I'm getting increasingly involved, and it's a momentum that builds throughout the course of writing and rehearsing and recording. It builds a momentum, and it becomes an unstoppable, exhilarating force. And then 3 months later, or whenever it is, when you finally handed over all the artwork to the record company and the masters and everything, then suddenly there's a vacuum, a big empty space in your life, and you feel the need to fill that space. Otherwise, it leaves you rather empty and hollow. But luckily, of course, there are concert tours to be engaged in or other things to do. So I kind of put all of this behind me. By the end of August, I'd delivered everything, or middle of August, I delivered everything to the record company. And I try not to think about or listen to the album until I actually really have to pay attention to it during rehearsal in 2 weeks' time. And at that point, I will be engrossed again in at least some of the tracks from the new album, because I have to learn to play them live as opposed to doing it in the studio. But it's good to take a break, good to leave it behind and come back to it fresh and hear it with perhaps a little more objectivity, in the same way as the fans will hear it, without necessarily having expectations or without feeling perhaps they already know what they need to know before they've actually bought the record. And of course, there are 2 or 3 tracks that they will have heard as teasers for the album, but that's just, 2 tracks out of 9 tracks.
Like you said, that you sort of felt like vacuumed and empty after putting everything into the art and the album. So how does the process work that you sort of like get into the next album? Does it still happen somehow like organically, that after a while and after a time your brain starts to get like come up with new ideas again, and then the process sort of like starts again? Or how does it happen for you?
There is a time when it feels right, and the time didn't feel right at the beginning of last year. I just felt I need a little more time to see, first of all, if I did want to make another record, and did the record company want another record from us. It wasn't until middle of May, I think, in last year when I started work, and then it became, a very quick process to write all the lyrics and come up with the melodies and do all the things that I had to do. It doesn't always happen in the same way or at the same time, but there's just a feeling of it being right and not analyzing it too much in terms of style or what the intent is. Even if it's a concept album, it's a loose concept and it gets solidified as you work through the process of writing and recording. I mean, I think I'd recorded most of the music on this album before I decided on the title track, which didn't have a title. I had all the lyrics and I'd recorded the lyrics, but I didn't have a title. The title Curious Ruminant doesn't appear in the lyrics of the song. It just came up as an idea, and I thought, great, well, I'll call that song Curious Ruminant, and that works for the whole album because it summarizes my approach, having, being a person who has curiosity about a variety of subjects and topics, a ruminant in the sense of being a person who is contemplative, who likes to think things over. Every day I try to be satisfying my curiosity and learning 2 or 3 new things that I didn't know yesterday. And then over the next day or 2 or 3, I like to think it over, whatever I've absorbed as new data onto that cranial hard drive. I then like to think it over and put it into context in my own life and times, and that sometimes leads to a new song lyric or a song idea. That's nice when it happens, and then I don't overthink it. I like it to grow organically in its own way, and the songs develop their own personalities. They tell me how they want to be when they grow up, and my job as a record producer is to listen to what my songs tell me.
So when you start making an album and the sort of first idea gets into your mind where you start like making it, is that normally the song that you sort of like try to build around it and it evolves into an album, or can it sometimes even be the like opening track or the last track on the album, or how does that process like work for you?
Well, it would depend on this new album. The songs were just one at a time, and there was no thought about how important they were or what should be a title track or where it should be positioned on the album in terms of running order. It was just a song at a time. But in the previous album, Rock Float, that was an album that began very much as a conceptual piece about essentially looking at some of the Norse gods and their functions and personalities in Norse mythology, because like many polytheistic beliefs, the Norse religion had, it had gods that looked like, sounded like, and behaved like people, because that's easier for folk to understand. And just as many of the Hindu gods, they behave and fulfill roles almost in a human form. Same with Roman mythology and Greek mythology. Gods very often in the guise of human beings. Even in Christianity, the role of one of those great prophets of the Abrahamic religions, Jesus of Nazareth, is elevated to almost a godlike status, becomes an avatar, if you like, for the Godhead, whether you call that Godhead Yahweh or God or Muhammad or Allah, rather. The prophets sometimes become almost as important as the God themselves, just as Muhammad has a sacred identity. And Jesus, the Christ, has a sacred identity in Christianity. But they still are a conduit, a way of understanding a more abstract idea of what God is. Because we don't, unless we're Michelangelo, we don't want to give gods human forms. That's too pedantic and too obvious in a way. Just, I suppose Michelangelo and other great painters of the era depicted God in a very real way. I mean, that's a blasphemy in Islam and in Judaism to try and create a pictorial likeness of God. And I personally go along with that. I think it's not a healthy thing to do, to give God a face and a mouth and hands and arms and presumably other parts as well, and to declare that God is a man. It seems to me that God is a spiritual force, and how you think of God is a much more abstract process. And so I'm definitely not a follower of any of the polytheistic beliefs, and I'm not even a follower of Christianity, the religion I grew into, but I'm a supporter of Christianity in a very active, hands-on way. I am a supporter. I put my hands in my pockets and give a lot of money to the church every year, or raise a lot of money through doing fundraising concerts for cathedrals. In fact, yesterday I was in Peterborough Cathedral just confirming a concert to take place later this year as a fundraiser for a cathedral that is struggling to survive with economic difficulties, as many of our great churches and cathedrals are, because we're not supported by the state as churches and cathedrals are in, well, particularly in northwestern Europe. Britain does not support. It's all private. It's just donations and private money that keeps the buildings, keeps the roof on. So, I mean, I'm actively involved in Christianity in the sense of the buildings in which that worship takes place, but I'm afraid of my own beliefs are not quite as cut and dried. I am the closest way to describe me is a panentheist. I won't bother to explain it. Look it up.
In terms of like the lyrics on the upcoming album, they feel like more personal to you. So was there like some reason why you wanted to have that kind of approach for them?
Well, partly that's just the way it was taking shape, but as it took shape, I thought, well, I'm going to carry on with this and give it a rather more personal expression. So there are a lot of I, me, and we pronouns rather than, he, she, and they, which is my more normal way of writing in a more objective way about other people and other ideas seen in a more objective and detached way. Well, there have been songs in the past where I have used I and me because I'm not writing about myself or my own viewpoints. Quite often I inhabit the character in the song. It gives it more authority. So I'm like an actor taking on a personality. So I sometimes have done that in the past. But I'm not really singing about me, whereas on this album, what I'm talking about is expressing feelings and views that are very much personal feelings and views, even though it is a band album. And in no way am I talking on behalf of the other guys in the band. I'm expressing my feelings and thoughts, not anybody else's. But since the other guys in the band don't read the lyrics, it makes no difference.
So like you said, it's a band album. So was that like clear all the way when you started writing it that this will be, again, a more like band-involved album for you?
Well, the guys in the band, two of them have been with me since 2004, one since 2010, and Jack is the new boy. He's only been playing with us for a couple of years, initially standing in on bass guitar and then playing keyboard parts on guitar, and then finally from March onwards last year, or February onwards last year, playing the lead guitar parts. Most of the band, we've been working together for many years, 20 years in the case of two of them. And that's really quite a long period of time. So as a lineup, it's quite a stable band lineup compared with many others over the years. And, the 28, 29 different members of Jethro Tull over the years, it's nice to get in the van and see the same faces, as long as I don't have to do it every day of the week.
In terms of like Jack, he's the new guy, a new guitarist. What kind of like role he had in the like writing process? Were he like involved a lot, or?
Well, it's like all the musicians. I mean, sometimes I give them some very clear-cut, defined parts that I want them to play. Sometimes I say, here's a rough demo, or here's the recording as it currently is. I give them, a little bit of guidance, but I let them come up with their own thoughts, their own suggestions, where to play and what to play. And then we can refine it. They send me a rough idea and we refine it a bit. And if we're doing that together in rehearsal, then it's kind of easier because you do it as you are working together. So maybe we can rehearse 2 songs in a day and record them the following day if we're doing it all together in the same place at the same time. But that's not always possible because the other guys in the band all have other commitments. And getting everybody together, even to do 2 days of rehearsal in March, I mean, literally, it was just looking impossible to find 2 consecutive days when everybody was available. Finally, one of them agreed to change the schedule, and so we did manage to get 2 days together. But when we're not actually all on tour, then the other guys are all quite busy doing things. It's not that easy to do it. We did it with the last album. Rock Floater was recorded and was rehearsed and recorded in a very concise period of time, because I'd included that many months before, said this is the time we're going to write and rehearse and record a new record. But I didn't do that in 2024. It was a bit more of a spontaneous writing and recording process, so they were not always available. In fact, my son played drums on several tracks, because Scott, our drummer, he's a drum teacher, and so he had a full schedule of days. He only managed to come in for 2 days to record.
So, like we already said in the beginning, that you will be kicking off the tour and coming to Finland to play 4 shows. And you already revealed that there's going to be new set list. So what can the fans expect from those shows?
They can expect, I think, probably more or less what they're going to get, which is a mixture of some old songs that possibly they haven't heard us play before, some songs that are not so old, but from a sort of classic period of 70s and 80s. And then they'll hear one song each from the last 2 albums and a couple of songs from the new album. So essentially, in 2 hours of music, it's a big picture, from the very beginning, from the first few weeks of Jethro Tull's existence, when we were playing at the Marquee Club, right the way through to finishing an album in August of last year. So it's the big picture, and I think people want to see examples of the different eras of Jethro Tull. So there is something, hopefully, that will represent most of that period of time. I'm not calling it the 7 Decades tour next year, because the 7 Decades tour that we were doing last year and part of the year before was featuring at least one song from each decade in which we'd been releasing albums. So yes, it's not quite a song from each decade, but it certainly goes from the earliest days at the Marquee Club, one particular piece of music which we were playing in January, February of 1968 at the Marquee Club and recorded for the first album. So it goes back right to the beginning, but doesn't stay there too long before we get into the Jethro Tull, the progressive rock band era, and then Jethro Tull, the folk rock band era, and then everything that follows on from there. But it's a bit of a mixture of everything. So hopefully people will find it acceptable.
Does it become like more and more difficult with each album to sort of try to even put on a set list, because you have so much material that you could play?
Yeah, well, the difficulties began in 1969, because when our second album was released, it was about leaving things out of the set list. And that got harder and harder with each successive album. It's a matter of leaving things out. And so you start being selective in a way that is, sometimes a little painful, because you think, well, that'd be a really good song to play, but I've already got 1 or 2 songs from that album in the set list. So, I don't want to have too many things from the same record. It is about leaving things out. It's a little painful. It's like taking your children to the fun fair and having to leave one of them at home.
Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to me. Anything you want to say as a closure to all the Finnish fans?
Well, it's a weird thing about Finland. I've been coming to Finland for many years, and the affinity for Finland is something that's always stayed with me from my first visits, when I suppose in a way it felt like a very different part of Europe, in the sense that it was next door to Russia, and you kind of felt very much a Russian sort of feeling about the landscape and the nature of people in the far northeast of Russia. I think that has continued with an interest in reading and watching Nordic noir, Scandi noir as it's known. So I've been a fan of novels and TV series set in Finland to this day. I have a sort of weird feeling about the landscape. Perhaps it's because it's a little bit like parts of northern Scotland that I'm familiar with, being born in Scotland. And although perhaps in some ways my geographical and genetic origins are more likely to be Norwegian or Danish rather than Finnish, I still have that feeling of Finland being it's like a very close cousin rather than a brother. And since it does lie on that dangerous border with a very scary country these days,
Unfortunately.
yeah, you feel that it is the one, along with the Baltic states, that are perhaps got the most to fear out of the Putin adventurism, which is unabated. And before he dies, I think he wants to try and reclaim as much of what he can possibly reclaim.
Yep.
These are the realities. I remember the first time I went to Estonia, 50% of the people were Russian speakers, and something like 45% were actually Russian in terms of having gone to Estonia for professional reasons. You are aware that with declarations of independence, it's never as clear and simple as saying, okay, you, just because you happen to be in a country that now has declared independence, you have to leave your geographical and genetic roots behind, because it's now called Estonia or Latvia or Ukraine. And so, it's dangerous territory to be tiptoeing around these gentle differences in different parts, especially in Ukraine, being a very big country and having a lot of Russian speaking and Russian influence still embedded in parts of its culture. And you can't pretend that doesn't exist. Or at least in a few places, people still regard themselves as Russian and either welcome or will tolerate being under Russian control again. And it looks like any peace agreement will embody exactly that happening. So national identity and the true feeling of identity amongst population can frequently be not the same thing, even in my own country, where there'll be a lot of people living in England who are Scottish and feel foreigners. When I grew up in Scotland, we had a couple of English boys in the school. They were tolerated. They were bullied a little bit, but there was definitely a sense of them and us. And when I then went to school in England, being the only Scottish boy in the class, again, I was made to feel very different. I was made to feel like a foreigner. And so we have that inherited difference between the four nations of Great Britain, the UK, the United Kingdom, as it's supposed to be. But there is that sense of, I think, quite healthy feeling that there is a difference between being English and Scottish and Northern Irish and Welsh. And I think those identities within the more all-embracing concept of the United Kingdom, it's kind of nice that we have that.
Yeah.
But in Europe, it's increasingly very messy through the huge numbers of people that have come to Europe from elsewhere and the degree of migration, some of it legal, some of it not. That is all made for a lot of difficulties in terms of people, in many cases, feeling imposed upon, that their national identity is being lost. Hence the move in many European countries to a more extreme right-wing position. And whether or not that is a good or a bad thing is not for me to judge. But we in the UK have a left-wing government again. But we have some hard right-wingers hovering on the edges of the democratic system, just waiting to pounce. So we'll see how it pans out. Anyway, there we go. And the Leningrad Cowboys are still in my affections and my heart. I first encountered them, I think, in Finland, but then elsewhere too. And like many people in Europe as a whole, and even in the UK, the Leningrad Cowboys are a hugely entertaining, very Finnish in the sense of having a rather dry sense of humor that I think Finland shares with Iceland, for example. We're very fond of the Helsinki band, like many bands, a bunch of art students and people but from Helsinki calling themselves the Leningrad Cowboys, which is brilliant. The whole idea is brilliant. And of course, they're there now. I guess most of the original band are no longer part of the group, but if the group is indeed still going, I hope it is. But anyway, yes, that's my feelings about Finland. They go back 30 years, I think. So nice to talk to you, and take care.